Greetings! Welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel, where I wanted to discuss something that's been on my mind quite a bit lately and has come up in quite a few different conversations. And that's the idea of bad storytelling and the negative impact that telling the wrong stories and believing the wrong stories can have. And I have a couple of thoughts on this, where there is some bad storytelling here in modern time that is dragging some things down and making some things harder than they need to be. But before I talk about those, I want to talk about some very real examples of bad storytelling from the past and how it actually did do material harm to some people. For the first of these, I want you to just kind of imagine yourself as a person in the late 1700s. And I want to imagine yourself two ways. I want you to think about yourself, firstly, as a member of the British Army during the Revolutionary War in your camp at night. And I also want you to imagine yourself as a member of the young United States forces. Either, I don't care whether you imagine yourself as a militiaman or standing army or whatever, but imagine yourself from both perspectives of both cultures that were clashing on those fields. It's night. You're listening to the sounds of the woods, maybe the frogs, maybe the crickets, but then all of a sudden you hear a pack of wolves howling, and they're fairly close. Now this is where the two perspectives comes in. If you were one of the colonizers and you're hearing this, you're used to it. You're used to wolves. You know from the sounds that they're gathering their group and they're about to go hunt deer. You can hear the story start to unfold. You hear the process of them coming together and then going out for the hunt. And then you fall asleep. If you're one of the British forces, you have a very different experience. Wolves in your area have been exterminated a long time ago. Not only do you not remember hearing them as a child, your parents didn't hear them, your grandparents didn't hear them, and their parents before them didn't hear them. Because in England, the wolves were exterminated, I don't know the exact date, but late medieval period, Renaissance, somewhere's in thereabouts. The wolves were gone, completely eradicated from the British Isles. So you have no lived experience. You don't know the story they're telling. You don't know that they're talking to each other and they're about to go hunt deer. You don't know what they're up to. All you know are the stories that you were told as a child, the fairy tales and the legends of wolves eating children. Wolves being a force of destruction. Wolves being perceived as something evil. So you hear them, you hear their calls, you hear them summon each other, you hear them howl together, and then you hear them go silent. And because you were brought up with the wrong stories, you think they're hunting you, which they're not. But because you heard the wrong story, you fed the wrong wolf, your mind's going down the wrong path, and you don't sleep. Okay? So the next morning comes. A battle is joined. One side is well rested. The other side is exhausted, anxious, and wonders where those wolves are, and is thinking as much about them as their opponents on the battlefield. And while I'm just telling a story and going through a thought process here, we know from the journals of both soldiers that this actually played out. And that the stress and anxiety, the needless stress and anxiety that the British were feeling hearing these wolves, was a factor in the Revolutionary War. Okay? Now, I don't want to go into the politics of anything, who was right, who was wrong. Yeah, it all happened, it all played out the way we did. We know who won. I'm not sad about the fact that, North America got some freedom from, empires, from overseas empires, right? I'm happy about that. But what I want to focus on right now isn't the geopolitics, it's the story and how it played out. When you tell the wrong story, when you feed the wrong wolf, when you have the wrong image of what's going on, it matters and it affects the flow of your life. So let's think about a couple other stories from the past, real examples where telling the wrong story has had some really devastating impacts. The first is those same colonizers coming over. Okay? They came and they landed, and they saw what they describe as a virgin forest. They didn't realize they were sitting in a garden. So the whole east coast of North America was a managed ecosystem. Wait, when the first Europeans landed, the whole east coast was a managed ecosystem. Think about what's going on. First of all, the runs in the rivers, the fish runs in the rivers are still intact. So every year you have massive inputs of nutrients flowing from the ocean into the core of the continent. North into New England, the fish runs were, salmon dominated. A lot of brook trout populations would run to the ocean too. And you have shad, and then you have all of the river herrings. You have the striped bass, which run. You have the eels, right? So every year there's these massive runs of fish. Now, we still see this in modern time out in the Pacific coast with the Pacific salmon. They die every year. The shad don't die every year. And the shad runs came way down into the mid-Atlantic and the South, the Carolinas, and maybe even to Georgia. I'm not 100% sure. But pretty far south, the shad are running. The shad will usually make 3 runs before they die. They don't die every run. But that also means that a third of them die every run. Each individual shad doesn't die the first time it runs. But every time you have a shad run, you have about a 1/3 mortality rate. That's nutrients going into the food web. That's nutrients washing ashore that the wolves and the bears are eating. The wolverine, where they were, are eating, right? All of these critters are feasting on these dead shad and dead salmon and dead trout and all of these things that are coming on. They're eating them, they're enjoying their meal, and then they're going and gifting the trees with fertilizer derived from the ocean. That fertilizer is going to fertilize those cove forests and the going up in the smaller creeks where they were getting into, but also the swaths of forest along the larger rivers like Susquehanna, the Delaware, and they are bringing nutrients into those trees. Then you have the passenger pigeons, which are flying around in massive flocks, feasting on those nutrients. When they find a good patch of woods that's in fruit, they'll feast on those fruit, and they'll fly other places to roost. And where they roost for periods of time, they basically kill the forest because of all their manure. They would deposit literally feet of manure in a period of weeks. The weight of their bodies would break branches. So now you have a patch clear cut with feet of manure, which originally came from the ocean. It's going to take a couple of years. But yes, those adult trees are going to die, but then new ones are going to grow. And what's going to grow? Berry fields, wild plum, Saskatoons, blueberries, choke cherries, viburnums, right? All of these berry-producing plants are going to grow in that patch. They probably aren't going to redevelop into mature trees because the native people are going to burn it before they do to keep the berry field in place. And also, the bison and the elk and the moose are going to be in there. All of those have been exterminated from the mid-Atlantic now. A few patches of elk here and there, yes. And they're going to keep it in a low-growing berry condition as well. And then you have the people running up and down the trade routes, harvesting the best of the nuts that they find. It's interesting, central New York, the core of Haudenosaunee territory, is a disjunct population for a half a dozen species of nut trees that grow only in the south, but then also in the Finger Lakes, or only west of the Appalachians, except in the Finger Lakes. They were traveling and moving these and also planting these like around their home sites and around portage sites and canoe locations where they would sink every winter. They would sink the dugout canoes so that they didn't dry out and split. But then they're spending time there and planting these things. So you have this mosaic landscape, very, very rich, managed, supporting a population before smallpox came. The population of this area was higher than the population in Europe. And it was sustainable. They weren't destroying their resources. Their actions were playing off of the natural source sink flows in the landscape and just creating a richness that we can't imagine. And then the Europeans came and they started to write a story that this was a primeval forest untouched by man, when in fact it was managed by man, working with the natural flows, with knowledge of those natural flows, what we call TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. We'll come back to that in a big way here in a few minutes. But they were working with those flows and managing it, and the movement of those seeds across the landscapes was human. The management of those berry fields that benefited all of those big game animals was human. The origin, the spread of the small fruited seeds was pigeon, and humans worked with the pigeons without exterminating them at this point. Key word. But the movement of the best of those, taking advantage of what they knew was a shifting mosaic, planting into it, was human. And then smallpox came, and then genocide came. And then the people who brought the smallpox and the genocide said, oh, nobody's here. This is wild. We have landed in an empty forest. Which is not a good story. Because how's it play out? That myth of the empty forest, that myth of the idea that the richest forest that the Europeans had ever seen was devoid of people, then became part of the mythology of Thoreau's era. And when we started building the national parks worldwide, we were telling the myth of the empty forest and forgetting that so many of these things were managed by people. And that without people and without that traditional ecological knowledge, you don't get the richness back. You just get an empty, you get an empty forest. You get a lot of trees, you get a lot of bushes. But now they're mostly invasive species. And even some of those are native invasive species, right? Hay-scented fern is not an introduction, but it sure will suppress biodiversity, right? So this idea that when those first Europeans landed, they did not recognize that they were landing in a garden because it wasn't plowed in rows. They drove out the gardeners, lost the garden. But because they told the story wrong from the beginning, instead of inviting the gardeners back that have that knowledge and know how that worked back in the day, they drove everybody out and tried to turn it into a wilderness museum. And we lost a lot because of it. There are stories of native foods that we don't see anymore. There are stories of, for example, the wild persimmon and the wild maypop, the northern passion flower, of cultigens of those fruits, like large, the size of apples, in people's journals. And they're gone. Because when you lose the gardeners, you lose the garden. And since it was an unrecognized garden, described as an empty forest, there was no desire to keep the gardeners back. It's even worse in Mexico. So one of the things that is discussed a lot in ethnobotany circles is the conservation of native ancestors of domestic crops, because they still have that full genome. We've bottlenecked the genomes of our domestic crops so badly that there is a need to go back and refine some of the wild genes. So they're back in the 50s and 60s and whatnot, there were a bunch of conservationists that meant well, that were highly trained, highly skilled, highly educated, and meant well, that went to the areas where you have these wild ancestors of the cultivated crops and preserved them by establishing parks and kicking everybody out, including the native people who were living there at the time. In doing so, they drove out the traditional ecological knowledge told by telling the story of the empty forest. They chose to drive out the traditional ecological knowledge. And now those wild ancestors of domestic crops are facing extinction even more than before the parks are created. They need the native land management to survive. Wild rice in North America. There's 3 species. There's the 2 species in the north, the white-seeded and the black-seeded, the Monoman. They're doing okay. But then there's a 3rd species, the Texas wild rice, which evolved during the Ice Age, when the Southwest was much wetter and full of swamps. A lot of those low-lying areas were wetlands. We know that because the Glyptotherium, the giant armadillos, are always upside down, showing that they were floating when they died, even though their bodies are recovered from deserts. Okay? We know that there were vast swathes of swamp down in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. When the Ice Age ended, native peoples were already here, and they watched those swamps dried up. But they encouraged the beaver to dam the streams in a way that still is cooperative with fish population and fish movements. Beaver dams don't inhibit fish movements. We're not entirely sure why, but they don't. It's been shown. And they built an elaborate series of canals to irrigate their farm fields. So imagine the, Tucson, Arizona area, not as a desert with a city in it, but as a patchwork of canals and rivers and beaver dams full of fish, full of life, and full of rice, with cornfields extending out from those canals. But we brought genocide. We eliminated those systems. We plowed them, we dried them, we built on them, and now the Texas wild rice is almost extinct. And very likely will go extinct, because outside of that specific environment, which we don't seem willing to recreate, it can't live. The attempts, there have been multiple attempts to spread it and try to keep it, they don't work. It needs that environment that the native people were creating. But by telling the myth of an empty land, an unmanaged land, a land with no agriculture, We've exterminated some of the most brilliant forms of agriculture that have ever existed. And with it, we're losing this vast wealth of plants that could feed the people. Bad storytelling. Bad storytelling can be very, very harmful. So what stories are we telling today? If we want to get back to a place where we recognize and take care of the forest as an entity in and of itself that deserves its own respect, that then can care for us, if we want to get back to that place, we need to recognize it for what it is. It is bountiful. The forest, when cared for, can take care of all of our needs with no need for commerce, with no need for money, with no need for mass centralizing authorities. The forest will just care for the people if the people care for the forest in a good way. But we're still telling the myth of the empty forest. That land doesn't get good until it's improved and plowed. Right? That agriculture is where it's at. That agriculture is the only way forward. And don't get me wrong, there's elements of agriculture in the tending of the forest. And there's things that we can learn from agriculture to undo the damage that we've done. But we need to tell a story that feeds the good wolf, that recognizes that that abundance is a collaboration between the people and the land where they live. That driving people out, I've got to be careful how I say this, right? That driving the people out who have the traditional ecological knowledge is just as bad as filling that land with people that destroy the resources. Okay? So what stories are we telling? About the only stories that are accessible when you turn on your television are like the stories of social media, the stories of reality TV. And how do those stories go? Well, in the first rendition, you get a whole bunch of people who don't know anything about the forest where they're going. And you maroon them, and then you create a bunch of artificial circumstances where they fight with each other, and then a whole bunch of people voyeuristically watch them suffer. That's how those go. That's not a good story. That's not feeding the right wolf. That's perpetuating the mythology that man is in conflict with the forest. The mythology that got many British soldiers killed. We're still falling into that trap with that kind of story. And now it's evolved a little bit. Now we take people, and instead of putting them in a farcical community where they're taught to fight with each other, we put them out by themselves or in small groups, and we deny them everything and then watch them suffer. But it's still perpetuating the same harmful mythology. That the wolf is bad, that the bear is dangerous, that everything outside of the city wants to attack you. That's not true. They need respect. You don't want to go and pet the bear.
Aww.
I know. As cuddly as they look, you don't want to pet the bear. It's not going to go well for you. But the bear doesn't want to eat you. I mean, yes, I know polar bears are their own thing, but that's mostly because they never see us. They're just like, the weird-looking seal. I wonder what that is. I'll go check it out. Mouth. Like, how does a bear explore things? With its mouth, right? It's like, I gotta go see what that is. That's curious, right? You know, it's more curiosity behavior. But, you know, same with most shark attacks. It's a curiosity behavior. They're lipping at the weird-looking seal, right? So, I know those things exist, but they're very, very rare. That curiosity exists because of the rarity of the interaction. But the world out here doesn't want to eat you, doesn't want to hurt you. It's half of an equation to which we are the other half. And we really need to learn to tell better stories. The stories that look to the bright points of humans' interactions with all of this. Okay? The stories that look to the beauty of the food forests which filled the Americas before contact. And yes, it's not just North America. I'm speaking from a North American perspective, but we're now getting to a place where we're identifying lost Mayan villages by the trees that exist there, because the echo of that food forest is still present. Okay? So we can look to those things and honor the people with that traditional ecological knowledge. Lift them up and hold space for them so that they can help rebuild those things. We can look to our river systems and know that if they could carry shad in the past, they could carry it again. We can look to that bright point and work to rebuild it. We can recognize that the forest never was empty, that we're part of it. We isolate ourselves in cities and then look to the forest as something at best strangely beautiful, but still strange. No. We're as much part of the forest as those bears and those wolves and those deer and those bison. The wood bison should be in Pennsylvania. The woodland caribou at least should be in New York. The moose probably well down into Pennsylvania. Right? That's where they were before. We could bring those things back. But we're not going to do it if we keep talking about man or bear, what belongs in the forest. The answer is both. So I've been kind of ruminating on these things for a while, because the bad stories are getting stronger all the time and getting pushed by algorithms more and more all the time. The more you can show somebody suffering, the more voyeuristic viewership that you get, the more the algorithm pushes that. Whereas the berry picking videos are going to get lost. But the berry picking videos are the good story. So let's tell that story. The story of collecting materials, working with what's around us, harvesting those wild foods, harvesting the wild game, but respectfully, building up those populations. In areas where the predators are lost, finding a better balance, not as trophy hunters, but as students of the wolf. Because they work very differently than humans who just want to shoot a big buck for boasting rights with the other guys in their camp. These are very different ways of approaching a hunting activity. So let's get back to some of those better stories. That's something we're trying to do here, but it's something that we can't do alone. There has to be push. There has to be a desire to watch that. If people want the better stories, the algorithm will start serving them, because ultimately the people who are in charge of writing the algorithms want viewership for ad money. So let's do that in a good way. Cling to those good stories and walk away from the bad ones. And when we let that move through us and become part of how we think and how we act and react, it will build. But it's absolutely a group project. So, I hope that this has given you some things to think about. We do have a Patreon channel. I'm not pushing that in this video, but I'm very grateful for those who are there. And if you want to support us that way and the work that we're doing here, absolutely grateful. But most of all, I hope that you will tell better stories, cling to better stories, watch better stories, feed the better wolf, so that we can move forward together. Not do I want to meet the man or the bear, but that the man and the bear are working on the same project. Please keep joining us here at Old Ways Rising Farm so that we can tell the better stories together.